3. The war against Russia. In foreign policy, the war against Russia was the pivot around which the Neue Rheinische Zeitung moved. It regarded Russia as the one really dangerous enemy of the revolution and one which would inevitably enter the struggle as soon as the revolutionary movement took on a European character. It was quite right in this respect, for whilst it was calling for a revolutionary war against Russia, the Tsar was offering the Prince of Prussia the use of the Russian army to re-establish despotism in Prussia by armed force. The Neue Rheinische Zeitung, however, was not aware of this, but it has since been proved by documentary evidence, and a year later the Russian bear saved Austrian despotism by crushing the Hungarian Revolution in its clumsy embrace. The German Revolution could not be finally victorious without destroying both the Prussian and Austrian absolutist states, declared the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, and this would remain impossible so long as the power of the Tsar was unbroken. As a result of such a war against Russia, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung hoped for a tremendous release of revolutionary forces such as had taken place in France in 1789 as a result of the war against feudal Germany. In the words of Worth, it treated the German nation en canaille. And this was true in that it bitterly scourged the lackey services which the Germans had rendered for 70 years against the freedom and independence of other nations in America and France, in Italy and Poland, in Holland and Greece, and still other countries. Now that the Germans are beginning to cast off their own yoke, they must alter their whole policy towards other countries. Otherwise they will find that the chains they have forged for others will entangle their own shadowy young freedom. Germany will win its own freedom to the extent that it leaves other countries in freedom. The paper denounced the Machiavellian policy which, although it was being shaken to the roots in Germany itself, deliberately fomented a narrow-minded hatred of things foreign in defiance of the cosmopolitan character of the Germans, in order to paralyze democratic energies, divert attention from itself, turn the molten lava of the revolution from its course, and forge a weapon of internal oppression. Despite the patriotic howling and drumming of almost the whole of the German press, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung came out from the beginning on the side of the Poles in Posen, the Italians in Italy and the Hungarians in Hungary, and mocked at the profundity of the combination and the historical paradox which sought to lead the Germans into a crusade against the liberty of Poland, Hungary and Italy at a time when the same Germans were fighting against the very governments which proposed to lead them. Only a war against Russia would be a revolutionary war for Germany. In such a war it could wash away the sins of the past, vindicate its own manliness, defeat its own despots, advance the cause of civilization by sacrificing its own sons in a manner worthy of a people which has flung off the chains of long-suffered and inert slavery, and win freedom at home by fighting for freedom abroad. As a result of this attitude, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung supported the cause of Polish freedom more passionately than that of any other oppressed nation. The movement in Poland in 1848 was limited to the Prussian province of Posen because Russian Poland was still exhausted from the revolution of 1830 and Austrian Poland from the insurrection of 1846. It was modest enough in its attitude and demanded hardly more than had been promised by the treaties of 1815 but never granted: the replacement of the army of occupation by native troops and the holding of all positions by natives. In the first spasm of fear occasioned by the events of the 18th of March, the Berlin government promised a national reorganization, though naturally, it had no intention of ever carrying it out. The Poles were trustful enough to believe in its goodwill, but it deliberately incited the German and Jewish population of the province of Posen and systematically provoked a civil war whose atrocities were almost completely the guilt of the Prussians. Deliberately provoked to armed resistance, the Poles fought gallantly, and more than once they routed forces superior to their own in numbers and equipment, for instance, on the 30th of April near Miloslav, but in the long run the fight of the Polish sides against Prussian shrapnel was hopeless. In the Polish question also the German bourgeoisie played its usual role of treachery and panic. Before the March Revolution it had realized clearly enough how closely the cause of Poland was connected with the cause of Germany. And even after the 18th of March its spokesman had declared at the so-called preliminary parliament in Frankfurt that to work for the re-establishment of national unity in Poland was the solemn duty of the German nation. But this did not prevent Kampfhausen from playing the lackey to the Prussian Junkers in this question also. He carried out the promise of national reorganization in a shameful fashion by wresting one piece after the other from the province of Posen, in all over 2/3, and causing the Federal Diet to incorporate it in the German League. This piece of infamy was the last gasp of that body, which ended its life miserably amidst the general contempt of the German people. The National Assembly in Frankfurt was now faced with the question of whether or not it should recognize as its members those deputies who had been elected in the annexed parts of Posen. After a debate which lasted 3 days, it decided as might have been expected of it, and this degenerate offspring of the revolution gave its blessing to the infamy of the counter-revolution. The importance attached by the Neue Rheinische Zeitung to this question can be seen from the fact that it dealt with the debate in Frankfurt in great detail and published 8 or 9 articles, some of them very long, on the subject, in striking contrast to the contemptuous brevity with which it usually dismissed the parliamentary phrasemongering of this assembly. This series of articles represents the longest work ever published in the paper, and both content and style suggest that Marx and Engels were joint authors. In any case, Engels had a large share in the work, which bears unmistakable signs of his style and manner. The first thing which strikes one in these articles, and it is a feature which does the paper all honor, is the refreshing frankness with which they expose the contemptible game which was being played with Poland. However, the moral indignation of which both Marx and Engels were capable, far more capable than the worthy Philistine could even imagine, had nothing in common with the sentimental sympathy which, for instance, Robert Blum in France, showed the maltreated Poles. Their judgment on the efforts of the respected leader of the left wing in this direction read, empty tub-thumping, but as we are gladly prepared to admit, tub-thumping on the grand scale and in a good cause, and their judgment was well-founded, for Blum failed to realize that the betrayal of Poland was at the same time the betrayal of the German Revolution, which thereby lost an indispensable weapon against its deadly enemy, Tsarism. Marx and Engels passed the same disrespectful judgment on the demand for the general fraternization of the peoples, that vague aspiration towards fraternity irrespective of the historical situation and the social development of the peoples involved. For them such phrases as justice, humanitarianism, liberty, equality, fraternity and independence were no more than moral phrases which sounded fine but played no role in historical and political questions. What they termed modern mythology was always abhorrent to them, and in the hectic days of the revolution they admitted only one test, for or against. The Polish articles of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung breathe a spirit of real revolutionary passion which raises them high above the usual pro-Polish phrases indulged in by the common run of Democrats. And even today they stand as an eloquent proof of the keen and penetrating political insight of their authors. However, they are not completely free of errors with regard to Polish history. It was certainly of great importance to point out that the struggle for Polish independence could be successful only if it were at the same time a victory of agrarian democracy over patriarchal feudal absolutism, but they were wrong in assuming that since the Constitution of 1791 the Poles themselves had realized this. It was also incorrect to say that the old Poland of aristocratic democracy was dead and buried, but had left behind a vigorous son, the Poland of peasant democracy. The Polish Junkers who had fought with incomparable bravery on the Western European barricades to free their people from the stifling embrace of the Eastern powers were regarded by Marx and Engels as the representatives of the Polish aristocracy, whereas in fact the Leluls and the Miroslavskis had been steeled and purified in the flames of the struggle and had raised themselves above their class as Hutton and Sickingen had once raised themselves above the German feudal class, or, in the less distant past, Clausewitz and Gneiss are now above Prussian Junkerdom. Marx and Engels soon abandoned this error, but Engels always clung to the disdainful judgment passed by the Neue Rheinische Zeitung on the struggle of the southern Slav nations and groups for national freedom. In 1882 he still maintained the attitude he had taken up in 1849 in his polemic with Bakunin. In July, 1848, Bakunin came under suspicion of being an agent of the Russian government, and a report to that effect was published in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung from its Paris correspondent, Ueberbeck, while a simultaneous and similar report was published by the Havas Bureau. However, this suspicion was revealed almost immediately as baseless, and the Neue Rheinische Zeitung published a handsome apology. At the end of August and the beginning of September Marx travelled to Berlin and Vienna, and in Berlin he resumed his old friendly relations with Bakunin. When Bakunin was expelled from Prussia in October, Marx came out with a strong condemnation of the authorities. When Engels published his polemic against Bakunin in connection with an appeal the latter had issued to the Slavs, he began with the assurance that Bakunin was our friend, and only then proceeded to attack Bakunin's pan-Slav tendencies, though he did so with considerable severity. In the Slav question also the interests of the revolution were paramount in determining the attitude of Marx and Engels. The Austrian Slavs, with the exception of the Poles, had sided with the reaction in the struggle of the Vienna government against the revolutionary Germans and against Hungary. They had taken revolutionary Vienna by storm and handed it over to the merciless vengeance of the royal and imperial authorities. At the time when Engels was conducting his polemics against Bakunin, they were again in action against insurrectionary Hungary, whose revolutionary war was reported by Engels through the columns of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung with expert knowledge, but at the same time with such passionate partisanship that he overestimated the level of the historical development of the Magyars as he had previously overestimated that of the Poles. Answering Bakunin's demand that the Austrian Slavs should be guaranteed their independence, he declared, "Not on your life." Our answer to the sentimental phrases about fraternity which are now offered to us on behalf of the most counter-revolutionary nations in Europe is, hatred of Russia was the first revolutionary passion of the Germans and it still is. Since the revolution this hatred of Russia has been enhanced by hatred of the Czechs and the Croats, and, together with the Poles and Magyars, we can secure victory of the revolution only by energetic terrorism against these Slav peoples. We know now where the enemies of the revolution are concentrated, in Russia and in the Austrian Slav countries, and no amount of phrases and appeals to a vague democratic future for these countries will prevent us treating our enemies as our enemies. And therefore Engels proclaims a merciless struggle to the death against counter-revolutionary Slavdom. These lines were not due solely to a fierce wave of anger and indignation at the slavish services rendered by the Austrian Slavs to the European reaction. With the exception of the Poles, the Russians and perhaps the Slavs in Turkey, Engels denied the Slav peoples any historical future, for the simple reason that all other Slavs have not the first historical, geographical, political and industrial conditions for independence and national life. Their struggle for national independence made them the willing tools of Tsarism, and all the well-meaning self-deceptions of the democratic Pan-Slavs could not alter this fact in the least. The historic right of the great civilized peoples to pursue their revolutionary development was more important than the struggle for independence of these small, crippled and impotent nations and groups, even if here and there some delicate national flower should be nipped in the bud. As a result of the greater struggle these little nations and groups would be privileged to take part in a process of historical development which would remain completely foreign to them if they were left to themselves. And in 1882 he again said very much the same thing. If the struggle of the Balkan Slavs for their independence ran counter to the interests of the proletariat of Western Europe, then these lackeys of Tsardom could go to the devil as far as he was concerned. Poetic sympathies had no place in the political struggle. Engels was wrong when he denied any historical future to the smaller Slav nations. But the fundamental idea which governed his attitude was undoubtedly correct, and the Neue Rheinische Zeitung held fast to this idea even in a case when it coincided with the poetic sympathies of the Philistines.